Hi everybody, welcome back to my YouTube page. My name is Eric, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that is of the utmost importance, and that is, why does God allow suffering? Now, those of you who may be older viewers of my channel, you'll know that I have covered this topic before, and while I do still stand by the things that I said in that video, I do want to give this topic a bit more depth than I had in that previous video. Don't get me wrong, I'm not claiming that I'm going to comprehensively give every single conceivable answer that could be given. After all, there are people who've devoted a good portion of their studies, and in some cases their entire studies, on this topic. So I don't expect to cover it exhaustively, but I do nevertheless think that it is a topic that's worth revisiting. Now, I just want to make a very important disclaimer before I begin this video. This video is not meant to be a substitute for any sort of counseling. The problem of evil is not merely a logical problem, it's an emotional one as well, for many people, especially those who've been the victims of particularly egregious evils in our world today. So this is not meant to take away the pain of your, experiences. It may provide some logical reasons, but in all honesty, this is not a substitute for real counseling, and I don't want this to be taken as such. Because if you're looking at this to cure your emotional pain, that you think, well, if I understand why evil happens, I won't feel bad anymore, you're probably not going to get that. That's not because your suffering is unimportant, it definitely is. But I simply can't cover a topic as philosophically and logically and intellectually rigorous as this one, and provide every single person with all of their nuances and experiences comfort at the same time. That's not because I don't have confidence, it's just that we as human beings are not computers who simply calculate things dispassionately and then we're good. We do have feelings and complexities even when logical answers are given. Let's use an example. Let's say there was an army captain, and due to being in a war, he has a chance to land a critical blow on his enemy. But he has to blow up a certain area that's also going to take a couple of his soldiers with him. Now, the officer can justify this. He did the right thing. And, nobody's going to punish him. He made the right call. But does that mean that the families of those soldiers are going to be happy about it? No. In fact, in some cases, when you show a grieving person why you had to do it, it may even make things worse. My point is that whether or not my arguments hold up, the fact that some people may not be comforted by it, which, again, comfort needs to happen. We serve a God who calls himself the God of all comfort, so that's totally fine. But in this video, I'm intending to deal more so with the logical problem of evil rather than the emotional one. They're both valid, they both need to be explored very deeply. But I only have so much time, and I just want to caution anybody who may think that this is a good intellectual argument to try and hold these sorts of arguments to the standard of satisfying somebody's emotional distress or basically making it go away, because that's not what these arguments are intended to do. I will give some brief words to comfort and console anyone who may be suffering at this point at the end of the video. But for now, I'd like to direct your attention to the logic of the situation to hopefully satisfy anybody who may be dealing with the intellectual side of the problem of evil. Now, the primary people who advance this type of an argument are, more often than not, atheists or, on occasion, sometimes deists. But there is one thing that we have to get straight whenever you're interacting with an atheist on this topic. Atheists will often, constantly, and never-endingly try and say, the burden of proof is on Christians to prove that their God exists. And here's the thing. They are correct. However, atheists in this case are making a positive claim, whether they want to or not. You see, it is true that anybody who makes a positive claim does have the burden of proof. If I positively say that God exists, then yes, I do have to prove that. However, when an atheist says the world that we live in is not compatible with the God that is described in the Bible as all-loving, then they are making a positive claim, and they have to back it up. Now, to be fair, I am not saying that the problem of evil proves positively that the Christian God exists. My contention here is to merely say that the world that we live in is not incompatible with a all-loving and all-powerful God, despite the evil that is present. I do believe that we can prove that God exists, but that's a topic for another day. For now, I am merely going to address and debunk the positive claim that many atheists will try and make, that the world we live in is incompatible with the God that Christians believe in, which is the God of the Bible. Because that is simply not true. Now, first, let us define what sort of attributes the Christian God has. First, let's talk about omnipotence. Omnipotence, what it means is essentially that God does not have limits on his power. He has unlimited power. Now, this has been expressed in passages such as the book of Genesis, where God talks to Abraham and Sarai, basically saying, I'm the Lord, is anything too hard for me, regarding the miraculous birth of Isaac. It also is talked about with Jesus when talking about, is it possible for a rich person to enter heaven? And he says with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. It's also expressed in the book of Job, where Job kneels down before God and says, I know that you can do all things, and nothing of yours, no plan of yours can be thwarted. Now, here's where things start to get interesting, because there is a classical objection to omnipotence as the question of, can God, for example, make a boulder that's so big he can't lift it? Or can God create a being that's more powerful than him? And the answer is no. Now, here's why. Now, a lot of people will try and say, well, wait a minute, are you saying God can't do something? How is it that you just said God can do anything, but he just can't, but that he can't do this? Well, here's the thing. There are really two ways to interpret those passages. One is that God can do everything except basically create philosophical contradictions. Like, for example, he can't have somebody as being a married bachelor at the same time, in the same place. Now, he can create somebody who, and then choose to not have them get married at one point in time, and then later be married at another point in time. That's fine. But can he create somebody who is presently, at this moment in time, both married and a bachelor at the same time, according to the traditional definitions of what those terms entail? No, because by definition, if you are married to somebody, you're not a bachelor. Now, here's where some atheists may think that I'm just playing with philosophical definitions and trying to squirm my way out of something. But here's the thing. If we go with option number 2, which is that God can do nonsense, essentially he can just create logical contradictions as much as he wants to, okay, in that case, every single objection that you have to Christianity just went out the window. Why? Well, it's simple. Because if God is, omnipotent in the sense that he can just make nonsense, well then guess what? I can just easily say, well, God, yeah, he's all-loving, all-powerful, and he doesn't like evil, but he also allows evil. And you can say that's contradictory. I'm like, so what? God can create logical contradictions, and he can still be right. So, okay, if you want to just go completely, utterly blunt with those definitions, fine, that's okay. In that case, your argument is completely invalid. It doesn't work. It is not incompatible with the world that we live in, because, God can just create a world that's contradictory. Doesn't matter. Now, my interpretation of those verses is God can do all things, meaning he can do things that are, because logical impossibilities aren't things per se. Basically, God can do anything that's not a contradiction, shall we say. As in, now, let me be clear about something. The laws of logic and the laws of nature are different. There's nothing illogical or contradictory about having a God who can supersede the laws of nature in some way. It's perfectly logical to say that there are laws that govern what certain natural things cannot do, but there are other things that are supernatural that can accomplish many of those same things, which are impossible for natural processes to do. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, how does this factor into the problem of evil? Well, in order to understand how omnipotence factors in, we also have to understand another attribute of God, God's holiness. Now, basically, what that means is God cannot violate his holy character. Because, and here's how that works with the omnipotence. God cannot do anything that is logically contradictory. And it would be logically contradictory for somebody who is holy, perfectly holy, to act out of character with that holiness. And the Bible directly teaches this. In Hebrews 6:18, it says, it is impossible for God to lie. He cannot tell a malicious lie just for the fun of it. That's not what he can do. He can't do that. It's out of character. It's logically impossible. Another attribute of God's is that he is not changeable. In the book of Hebrews, it says Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He cannot change that. It's not like thousands of years ago, he could say, it's good to help the poor. Everybody has to do it. It's not like 2,000 years later, he can just come along and say, don't really like that poor helping thing, so just, delete that. That's in his nature. So, God is immutable, he also is holy, and he is omnipotent. The Bible very clearly teaches these attributes of God exist together. Now, many people will try and say, but that's impossible. That's not a logical being at all. You can't have a being who can't change himself and is omnipotent. And the thing is that we simply don't have any experience with divine beings, like dissecting them like in like a scientific lab or something. We don't have the capacity to really be able to do that and say, well, this is contradictory and these attributes can't possibly exist between each other. We can't dissect an omnipotent being. So we really are contingent upon God, between God's revelation, in order to know whether or not a being like that can exist. And I would argue that because he's omnipotent, he is immutable. Because think about it. If you're omnipotent, nobody can force you to change. Nobody can break you, or nobody can damage you in some way that changes you. And for that reason, God's divine nature, it can't exactly be called a body because it doesn't have physical components. His divine nature doesn't, at least. His divine nature cannot be changed because it's simply too powerful to be changed by anything, external and even himself. Now, there is one final attribute that I would like to discuss, and that is the idea of God's timelessness. Now, timelessness is honestly one of the most complex and debated attributes of God. What it entails, what it feels like, what it looks like. The truth is, in all honesty, we don't have enough information to confidently judge what it is like or what it would be experientially for anyone experiencing it. We do know that God knows the future, as this has been demonstrated through fulfilled prophecy, as well as explicit biblical teaching, such as God knowing the end from the beginning. So, there are definitely things to think about with respect to God's timelessness that pertain to this entire argument of the problem of evil. Now, for example, let's take the idea that God can know what the future entails. He can know it. He knows the end from the beginning. Consider this. Think of it as a time-traveling experience. Let's say that I'm a person from the year, let's just make it up, 2400. Now, let's say that in the year 2100, there was 300 people who were killed, and as a result of this triggered a chain of events that eventually led to a greater good and many other people's lives being less hard, as well as many other people not being killed in the long run. Let's say that those 300 deaths prompted the United States to solve all of its social problems. And due to their deaths, we eventually did. Which led to less people getting killed per year and less people having lower quality of lives. Now, if I was a time traveler, and I witnessed this event in time, for example, does that mean that I should go and interfere with that? Well, no, because in many cases that would be disastrous for the timeline, and it may actually kill more people in the long run. It doesn't mean that you approve of what had happened. It just means that due to something bad happening, something good came out of it. And if God were to interfere with the timeline, we have no idea what the consequences of that would be. Would it make things worse? Would it make things enormously worse? The truth is, we can't possibly know that. Many things that were seemingly bad actually led to good eventually in our history. And again, we really just don't have adequate information to really judge whether God is making the right calls or not. But it doesn't mean that God is condoning the evil that is happening in the world. We simply can't prove any of that. Now, many people might ask the question, well, why can't God just do all the good stuff without any of the bad stuff? Like, why can't he just, change the rules or do some other thing or just do something else that's, isn't there some way to do that? And here's the answer. We don't know. Now, here's where we have to put all of the attributes of God together that we've discussed so far. The thing is that we have to revisit the attribute of God's immutability and God's holiness. Now, God's holiness means that there is a law that is within God himself, because we believe as Christians that God is the foundation of morality, and what is in his character is what is right. Now, the thing of it is that while we are privy to the contents of some of God's morality and some of God's ethics, we are not privy to all of them. For example, God's holiness is something that he cannot violate. Now, what exactly does his holiness entail or require in heaven, for example? Does his holiness require that if somebody sins in heaven, in the first heaven, then there's no way back for them? Well, it's possible, because the angels sinned and yet they seem to not have any opportunities henceforth to repent, and it's the same with Satan. Is that something in God's holy character that is needed? Now, many people will counter and say, well, if that's the case, why can't God just change the rules? God is immutable. He cannot change. So that's the other thing. We don't know all of the rules that are entailed, first of all, and we also know that God cannot just flip a switch and change them anytime he wants. We don't know a lot of what is entailed inside of God's immutable character. So that's the other thing that we need to consider whenever we're talking about the rules of heaven. And God has promised us that there will be a new heaven someday. But we don't know what it will take to get there and what it will take to maintain God's paradise for an eternity. We really don't know. So it really is not something we can judge or say that God is making the wrong call on this place or that place. We simply don't have enough information. What really tips the scales in favor of God, in my view, is that God has, for the most part, done just about everything that we have suggested to him. For example, there is the idea that people have constantly said, well, God can just create a perfect world. Why doesn't he do that? Well, he did that. The first heaven was perfect, and yet God apparently had a good amount of angels rebel against him, up to a third. The result of that was literally Satan. The next thing people have constantly complained about is, how can God possibly hold human beings accountable when we just have this sin nature? God has done that before, and the only examples of that that we know of human beings that have ever been perfect, aside from Jesus, were Adam and Eve. They didn't have a sin nature, and they ended up sinning. So we really don't know what exactly the result would be if God did these things again. We also have seen on many people thinking that God should just appear to more people. Well, he did that. And as soon as he did it on Mount Sinai, the people were just terrified of him. And they just figured that we'd actually like sort of a mediator to go between us, because God, his presence makes us feel like we're just going to die. God has appeared to the people, and even after he honored their request, there were a lot of people who still rebelled. They may have listened to him for a time, but honestly, the truth is, we really don't know how many people would maybe worship him for a time, but then fall away later. That's simply a factor that we don't know about. There are people who say, well, God should just keep doing miracles. God can just do so many miracles, why doesn't he do them? Well, while it is true that many people did come to the Lord and obey him because of the miracles, it was not a universal sentiment. Now, I would argue, of course, that miracles happen far more often than people realize, and that's a video for another day. But at the same time, you have to remember, God knows what the long-term consequences of something would be. And yes, it would undoubtedly be positive for some people. And what we do know is that miracles are not guaranteed to have long-lasting faith, which is what saves people. While it doesn't make this suffering any easier, it does put a significant dent in the argument that, oh, well, if God just prevented this from happening, it would necessarily result in a better outcome in the long term. Now, maybe the good thing that's going to come out of it will be a year from now. Maybe it'll be 1,000 years from now. We really don't know. We do know that God said that once somebody goes into the new heaven, they will come out no more. That's in the book of Revelation. And we also know that there will be no more death and no more suffering once the new heaven and once the final judgment is rendered. If our officials, politicians, and leaders have to make difficult decisions very often, we can only imagine how many God has to make every day, if you can even call it a day, because God is timeless. But when he has to deal with the past, present, and future, as well as billions upon billions of human beings throughout the entire timeline, we don't know, and we simply don't have adequate information to indict God as being either negligent or uncaring. Now, the second to last thing that we're going to talk about today is the problem of sin. The reason why this is so important to the problem of evil is because while there certainly are definitely things in the world that people who are sinners do not deserve to have happen to them. For example, if somebody was tragically, murdered, that doesn't mean that it was because of their sin that God decided to, let that happen. But it also means that we don't necessarily deserve a perfect world either. Now, many people may ask a lot of questions about, well, in what way, how are we sinners, and are we just sinners to some arbitrary rules that God is coming up with? And the answer is no. In fact, one thing that most people would agree with is that it's wrong to harm another person, or at least to, leave them alone to, suffer if you can do something about it. And the thing is that we do that much more often than we realize. Now, in what ways are we sinful? Well, for example, there are many ways, but one that can be very readily apparent is that we who are middle class, or maybe even some of us who are upper class, many of times we've bought something for ourselves when we could have used it to spend money on the poor, or given it to somebody else who really needed it. Or, imagine if we just spent maybe $100 less a month on ourselves, then, that could actually help somebody out, and how many times have we failed to do it? Now, again, I'm not saying that you have to give money to the poor all the time instead of just, spending money on yourselves. You're allowed to. The Bible does say that in Proverbs that a faithful man will abound with blessings. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a difficult balance to have where you care for other people and you care for yourself, and you do things that are enjoyable to you. The thing is that honestly, though, nobody strikes that balance perfectly. And as such, we really can't expect that our world will be perfect. There are countless ways in which, other than money, that we might hurt somebody. We may neglect a friend who may have, serious mental health issues and we not even know it. We may just simply, blow them off or something else like that. And we may not know, in many cases until it's too late, that we didn't do enough. There are countless ways in which we inadvertently hurt people by either our actions or in some cases our lack of actions. Now, I'm not saying this in order to drive guilt on you. I'm merely saying it to illustrate that we as humans cannot uphold a perfect world. And Christianity knows this. But that's the point. That's why we need the gospel. Jesus promises that if you just believe in him, that you will be guaranteed a spot in heaven where you will have a perfect nature. And it will last forever. The last thing I'll talk about is Jesus' love. Now, Jesus proved not only through the cross that he was willing to die for us, but it proved that he is so committed to his holy nature, which required sacrifice of an innocent person in order so that we would be saved. But it shows that he's not just consistent with his nature when it's convenient, but also when it's deeply inconvenient. And if he's willing to fulfill his nature and commit himself on that front, we can definitely trust that he's going to fulfill his promise of an afterlife in paradise. And it's such a small thing, he gives it as a gift. All you have to do is accept it. So thank you very much for listening to this video. I hope it blessed you. I hope it at least equipped you to really talk to people about the problem of evil and why it's not a problem for Christianity. But in any case, I love you guys. God bless.